My name is Tina Campt. I am the director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you, against all odds and against the MTA, to our 43rd Annual Scholar and Feminist Conference. Our title, as you know, is Subverting Surveillance, Strategies to End State Violence. Watching out, being watched. We live in a moment of extreme vigilance and preparedness. We are forced to do our due diligence in making ourselves and others aware of how we track our encounters and how our encounters are tracked by others. We are compelled to identify ourselves and at the same time constantly resist the imposition of categories of identity and identification that limit our potential, our aspirations, and our capacity to live without boundaries, restrictions, or constraints. It is this tension between resisting multiplying modes of surveillance, classification, and criminalization, and asserting our own non-sovereign forms of freedom in the face of these relentless technologies of capture that is the focus of this year's Annual Scholar and Feminist Conference. Our theme, Subverting Surveillance, names what we have conceptualized as a platform for reflection and for action. It frames this conference as an opportunity to grapple with the ever-expanding webs of surveillance that we are currently witnessing from prisons to parks to our personal electronic devices, as well as for strategizing on tactical and insurgent ways of hacking surveillance practices for resistance and self-defense. On behalf of the BCRW staff and the conference organizers, it is my great pleasure to welcome you back to the Barnard campus and to the Diana Center as our space of interaction. Now, there are a number of really extraordinary people who have worked very hard to make this conference possible, and I need to begin our day today by thanking them. First and foremost, I need to recognize our dear colleague and formidable scholar and the lead organizer for this conference who could not be here today, and that is Beck Jordan-Young. Beck Jordan-Young proposed this conference years ago, several years ago, and the theme grew out of her research as a socio-medical scientist and its extraordinary relevance to our time. Beck asked me to share her greetings with you all and to let you know that she is, quote, crushed to be missing this, but very happy that it's coming to fruition. Alongside Beck was her co-organizer, our BCRW program and media manager, Avi Cummings, who is standing right back there. Please give him a round of applause. Avi was really responsible for transforming Beck's original vision into a reality, and we have to acknowledge all the work that went into doing that. In addition to Beck and Avi, I need to recognize several other people who have worked hard to create the generative space that we hope this conference will be for all of you. At the top of that list is the fabulous BCRW team, Pam, Tammy, Hope, and Che. Please recognize them. They're scattered around. Equally fabulous are the research assistants, the student research assistants that you have encountered or will be encountering over the course of today. And they are BCRW RAs and friends of BCRW volunteers, Sona Quigley, David Sierra, Levi Kraske, Krish Bhatt, Nicola Douglas, Clara Baccaro, Emily Hay, and Yvette Kleinbach. They are our ground game, and we are deeply grateful to them for all that they give us. Thank you to them. Finally, we get tremendous, almost invisible support from administrative staff at this conference, and we would be remiss if we didn't recognize them as well. Our communications team, events management, IMATs, especially Ken and Christian, who are making it possible for us to send these thoughts and ideas out into the world, and the catering team led by Goldie, who keeps us fed. And as well as the facilities folks who really do prepare and maintain this beautiful space for us. Please recognize them as well. So without delay, what I'm now going to do is introduce our panelists for this first panel entitled Policing, Prisons, and Abolitionist Visions. We have 4 inspiring and really extraordinary speakers. And I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, which is going to be the same order in which they'll be speaking. Our first panelist is Jordan Campt. Jordan Campt is a term assistant professor of American Studies here at Barnard College. He is the author of Incarcerating the Crisis, Freedom Struggles and the Rise of the Neoliberal State, and co-editor with Laura Pulido of the late Clyde Woods' Development, Drowned, and Reborn, the Blues and Bourbon Restorations in Post-Katrina New Orleans. Our second panelist is Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is professor of geography and director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at the City University of New York Graduate Center. She is the author of the prize-winning Golden Gulag, Prison Surplus Crisis and Opposition in Globalizing California. More recently, she is the author of Beyond Bratton, Abolition Geography, and the Problem of Innocence. Gilmore is a co-founder of many grassroots organizations, including the California Prison Moratorium Project, Critical Resistance, and the Central California Environmental Justice Network. Following her is Cristina Heatherton, who is an American Studies scholar and historian of anti-racist social movements. She is an assistant professor of American Studies here at Barnard, and she's currently completing her first book, The Color Line and the Class Struggle, the Mexican Revolution, Internationalism, and the American Century. With Jordan Campt, she has recently edited Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter. Finally, and in no way finally, we'll be hearing from Mariame Kaba. Mariame is an organizer, educator, and curator who is active in movements for racial, gender, and transformative justice. She is the founder and director of Project Naya, a grassroots organization with a vision to end youth incarceration. She has co-founded multiple organizations and projects over the years, including We Charge Genocide, the Chicago Freedom School, the Chicago Task Force on Violence Against Girls and Young Women, Love and Protect, and most recently, Survived and Punished. Mariame is also co-organizer of the Just Practice Collaborative, a training and mentoring group focused on sustaining a community of practitioners that provides community-based accountability and support structures for all parties involved with incidents and patterns of sexual, domestic, relationship, and intimate community violence. Please welcome all of our panelists. They will be speaking for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then following that, we'll have a conversation with the panelists and then open up to the broader audience. Welcome, panelists.
Thank you, first to Tina for the kind introduction and for hosting us here. I also want to thank Beck Jordan Young for the invitation, and Avi, Pam, Tammy, Hope, Che, the entire BCRW staff. They really are a beacon of hope on Barnard's campus. So it's so nice of you to bring us all here. I'm really indebted to you. And I'm thrilled to be on this panel with Ruthie, with Mariame, with Christina, who I've learned so much from, and I'm really excited about this dialogue. And last but not least, all of you. There's many scholars, friends, students in the audience, so I'm excited about the discussion. So without further ado, let me jump into it. I'm going to get this done in 10 minutes. Ruthie's going to stop me if I don't. Yes. In today's conversation about abolition, I want to foreground the relationships between racial capitalism, counter-subversion, and the normalization of the security state. I want to outline the political stakes in theorizing how the ideological legitimation of securitization, by which I mean the routine and everyday surveillance and policing of space in the interest of global capital, has its geographical roots in a Cold War counterinsurgency. With its strategically located means of cultural production and dynamic network of organizations, Harlem, where we locate ourselves, became an epicenter of this Cold War reaction. And what follows, I will argue that this counter-subversive project has produced a historically distinct common sense that saw as its historic mission the rollback of the gains of freedom struggles and suggest how framing opposition to surveillance in terms of redistributive justice can provide a broad, can provide a basis for constructing a broad alliance between anti-racist, anti-imperialist, radical feminist, prison abolition, and social justice movements. And again, I'll do it in like 9 minutes now. To understand mass surveillance today, we need to grasp its antecedents in the Cold War counterinsurgency and the rise of the Red Scare. On August 27, 1949, Paul Robeson was set to headline a benefit concert in the Lakeland Acres Park outside Peekskill, New York, for the Harlem Civil Rights Congress, an organization that had been deemed subversive by the national security state. Taking place an hour north of Harlem, about 40 miles, off a country road between Peekskill and the Bronx River Parkway, the event was intended as a space for the articulation of visions of possible futures. Robeson had achieved the status of folk hero amongst many in freedom, labor, and social movements for his political and cultural resistance to Jim Crow and of U.S. imperialism, as well as his ability to link freedom struggles in the U.S. to global struggles for dignity and justice. The concert, organized by the group People's Artist, was violently attacked by a mob as police and state troopers watched while they chanted racist and fascist rhetoric, assaulted concert goers with billy clubs and brass knuckles, and set fire to the stage in a frenzy stirred by populist anger about Robeson having said that Black people would not fight a war abroad when their enemies were the racists who subjugated them under Jim Crow capitalism. Robeson was forced to escape and was taken back to Harlem after what the MC of the events, novelist Howard Fast, read as an attempted murder. The organizers again tried to hold the event on September 4th, and 20,000 people attended to watch Robeson perform, only to be brutally attacked as they attempted to leave by an alliance on the right led by a well-dressed Peekskill real estate broker. Many on the left read the events as a decisive step toward the construction of a more authoritarian security state and the dominance of the most reactionary sectors of capital. By 1948, movements in opposition to Cold War policies and Jim Crow racism were responded to with increased surveillance, incarceration, and deportation. The security state pursued a drive to divide and purge social movements of their radical leadership. This crusade, led by Joseph McCarthy, Roy Cohn, Richard Nixon, and others, was directed against radicals in unions, cultural institutions such as publishing companies, schools, universities, broadcasting and film, as well as the radical wing of freedom movements. The events at Peekskill can therefore be read as an organized political effort to undermine the popularity of the Harlem CRC among working people in Harlem and to enforce a kind of anti-communist settlement. To be sure, the Harlem branch of the CRC was influential for those who had been experiencing the deleterious material conditions of everyday life in this city. The CRC had organized against police violence, deportations, and civil rights abuses experienced by the Black, Puerto Rican, and immigrant working class residents in particular. It provided political leadership and education about the historical roots of policing, prisons, and surveillance in the political economy of racial capitalism. The concert at Peekskill and others like it were organized as part of a mass defense campaign, or to support mass defense campaigns for those impacted by Jim Crow, like Rosalie Ingram, a sharecropper in Georgia accused of murdering her white landlord after sexual threats. The case of Black truck driver Willie McGee, who had been sentenced to death in Mississippi after having been accused of raping a white woman, and the Trenton Six in New Jersey, 6 Black men who had been accused of murdering a white shopkeeper and convicted by an all-white jury. Established in 1946, the CRC was part of a broad alliance on the left that Mary Helen Washington says it was in Harlem, was militant, anti-colonialist, socialist, and feminist. This organization included the leadership of veterans of labor and freedom struggles like William Patterson, who had engaged in the defense campaigns at Scottsboro in Alabama in the early 30s. And they put a global spotlight on Jim Crow, imperial war, and police violence. As many in this room are no doubt aware, Patterson submitted a document called We Charge Genocide to the UN in 1951, at the same time as Robeson submitted that document here in New York City because he'd been denied a passport. Patterson explained that the report represented the struggle against the premature death created by racism, police terror, and finance capital's dominance, as he described it. The CRC also supported cases around victims of surveillance like Trinidadian-born migrant, radical intellectual, and organizer Claudia Jones. Raised in Harlem during the 1920s and 1930s, Jones was involved in what was called the Sugar Hill Set, a group of intellectuals and organizers in Harlem that included Lorraine Hansberry, Paul Robeson, Eslanda Robeson, Langston Hughes, and Alice Childress. Jones had long offered a black left feminist analysis of the relationships between race, class, gender, and U.S. imperial power. Her opposition to U.S. empire contributed to third world solidarity and internationalism. In 1950, she published a piece, Women in the Struggle for Peace and Security, on International Women's Day, arguing that global protests were significant for denouncing U.S. colonialism, the use of the atomic bomb, and the threat of nuclear war in Korea. She claimed that the state began using more coercive surveillance strategies as part of an effort to silence anyone, and these are her words, who hold ideas contrary to the official pro-war, pro-fascist line of that moment. In a clear use of confinement as a counterinsurgent tactic, Jones was incarcerated at the Alderson Federal Reformatory for Women in Virginia, where, as she put it, she served a year and a day sentence despite a heart condition and related illnesses. In turn, she was deported from the U.S., and in reflecting on the experience, she observed, I was deported from the USA because as a black woman communist of West Indian descent, I was a thorn in their side in my opposition to Jim Crow and for promoting radical internationalism, women's rights, and the critique of U.S. foreign and domestic policy. Now, Jones' depiction of the situation, I think, warrants a close study when thinking about the normalization of the security state, particularly because it speaks so powerfully to the roots of the current moment. She and a number of her colleagues were, of course, silenced during this moment as part of a broader criminalization of anti-racist freedom struggles. And this criminalization created a political vacuum in which the logics of the carceral warfare state would come to flourish. Indeed, I argue that the rise of an authoritarian carceral security state is inconceivable outside of the context of a counterinsurgency against freedom struggles in Harlem that took place in this period. As Ruthie Gilmore has argued, the entire superstructure of the neoliberal carceral states has its origins in the antagonism between insurgents and counterinsurgents in mid-20th century. The language of counterinsurgency provided the rationale for the expanded use of policing in prisons as wartime strategies of confinement with personnel, technologies, and tactics circulating into U.S. cities, prisons, and rural spaces. This expansion of militarization has led to a fundamental transformation of the political economy of racial capitalism at different geographical scales. In view of this present crisis and the ongoing threats of nuclear war in North Korea, it is worth reconsidering the analysis offered by the Harlem left during the early Cold War. Their insistence to fight against racial capitalism, militarism, and patriarchy could not be more important. As Dean Spade reminded us last night, the abolitionists' focus on the redistribution of resources away from counterinsurgency suggests a common basis for the forces of opposition to organize. In this decisive moment of history, this focus on redistributive justice suggests the stakes in the construction of a broad alliance against authoritarian security politics and austerity economics. In this way, abolitionists, many of whom are on this panel, are reclaiming the kind of materialist analysis of racism and of imperialism that had been pushed outside of the bounds of tolerable discourse since at least the early Cold War. The political task, as Ruthie has argued, is to build upon decades of organizing in constructing what she describes as a united front against, and I'm quoting her, the structural racism, structural poverty, and capitalism devouring the planet, end quote. After all, the dominant historical bloc has lost its consensus. It's no longer leading, but only dominant, exercising coercive force alone. And as that incarcerated intellectual Gramsci may have put it, this means that the great masses have become detached from their traditional ideologies and no longer believe what they used to. Such a moment is unpredictable, but it also offers a unique opportunity for the forces of opposition to organize. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I want to join my friends on the panel in thanking all of you for coming out today. I particularly thank Beck, Jordan Young, and Avi Cummings, and Pam Phillips, and all of the other fantastic people who organized us into this event and are endlessly patient with people like me. I appreciate that so much. In the abolitionist future, patience is going to be something that it's not now. That's my dream of it anyway. And Tina and I have tried to be in the front of the room together for years. We finally did it. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Would somebody tell me when I have 2 minutes left, 2 of 10? So to begin, I have a few slides. And I also want to say that we're not working in a chronological order. So Jordan took us into the past. I'm going to talk more about the present. Christina's going to dip us down into the late 18th and early 19th century, and then I think Mariame will bring us back into the 21st century. So don't think that this is going to build to a teleological revelation of what is to be done. It's not. But it is going to be, I hope, a revelation. So 3 preliminary points and then my provocation. The first is that abolition requires that we change one thing, which is everything. Everything. So when one says prison abolition, one cannot only be talking about prison. That doesn't mean anything. Abolition is not absence, it is presence. And indeed, what the world will become already exists in fragments and pieces, in experiments and possibilities. So those who feel in their gut deep anxiety that abolition means we knock it all down, do scorched earth, and then start something new, let that go. That's not what it is. It's building the future from the present in all of the ways we can, in what we call non-reformist reform. The second is to remind everyone that racial capitalism is all of capitalism. There is not 1 minute in the history of capitalism, not 1 minute, that was not racial. And that means, write this down, that means that if indeed, as many have argued, the capitalism we experience today had its origin and early development in rural England, then the relationships between and among the people in that rising capitalist system, all of whose ancestors might have become white, was already racial. Following that? And if you want to review that, you can read Abolition Geography and the Problem of Innocence. It is repeated there by me. And the third thing I want to say as preamble to my ambling is that when we think about the state, we are also then necessarily thinking over and over again about racial capitalism, and we are also thinking over and over again about the social relations through which value is produced, both the value that becomes appropriated by capitalists, but also all of the use values that make life livable and joyful, all of that. So capital state labor, or capital state households, or capital state, all of those social relations is what we're talking about. So when we talk about the state, we must, as some of our colleagues and comrades discussed last night, especially Nandita, we must be wary of fetishizing the state. Fascists fetishize the state for a whole set of purposes. And anti-fascists also have a tendency to fetishize the state. Okay? I'm not an anarchist either. Watch out for fetishizing the state. The state doesn't think. Right? The state doesn't think and do. That people enliven the state to think and do. If that were not true, I wouldn't be wasting your time and mine talking. All right, so a few more things to say. This is an artifact. It's not information, so don't worry that you can't read it. Some years ago, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, the New York State Terrorism Intelligence Unit submitted their regular report to the leadership of NYPD discussing the kinds of terrorist threats that they encountered and sought to bring to the leadership's attention in the period of about 1 week. So we're talking about 7 days of terrorism activities. Terrorism activities included, as people who are based in New York and others probably know by now very well, Muslim student organizations at the City University of New York, which is where I teach. Muslim students going camping and praying together. The Terrorism Information or Intelligence Unit also covered the fact that Jordan Flaherty, fantastic journalist and activist out of New Orleans, was coming to New York. They also covered the fact that people were organizing because a verdict was coming out concerning the police killing of a young man called Sean Bell, and they expected that there would be action, oppositional and dismayed action and protests. Other things were in this 1 week list. And I show you this artifact so that we can think about the fact that the people who enliven the agencies and policies and institutions that we call the surveillance state are thinking about all of us all the time together. They're already doing that. This is not something that we have to figure out how to do on our own. They've got that. So what do we not have to counter the counterinsurgency? So surveillance requires, of course, technology. It requires categories. It depends on certain kinds of subjectivities. And in this era of neoliberal racial capitalism, it also requires a certain ideological normalization, or put that in other words, common sense acceptance that devolution, making things smaller and smaller and smaller, is a good and natural thing, right? So at the same time that there's increased centralization of the capacities to surveil, to exclude, to punish, to reward, indeed, there's also the notion that states' rights are back, that counties in the United States, there are 3,100 counties, that counties ought to be doing the major determination about criminalization and punishment that the states had taken over for the last 35 or 40 years, and so forth. And what has happened to us is that we have absorbed these norms as though they were actually the only way that life could be lived. And we have devolved ourselves and then wonder where our allies are. This happens over and over and over again. We say, this is my issue, these are my people, this is my vulnerability, this is how I am anxious about the likelihood of premature death. Now, who can I be in alliance with? I suggest to you that thinking that way is thinking in the dominant mode, and therefore undoing the dominant mode will be impossible. It is a militarized way of thinking when we think in terms of allies. Because when we think in terms of allies, then what we're thinking is that at the end of the war, these allies will go back to their place, and these allies will go back to their place, and these allies will go back to their place, i.e. nation-state ideology, territorialized ideology, and a fundamental, as it were, biological separation, whatever kinds of differences we are concerned to liberate. In other words, one of the problems that I think has been ripe for critique and undoing is the problem of confusing difference and the important distinctions of difference, which is to say, what distinctions matter when we assert happily or with fear the differences that we have come together to discuss at this fantastic conference. Where am I with my 2 minutes? I have 2. That's great. That's great. So what I suggest we do is take surveillance into ourselves and think about surveillance, which is the systematic observation and study of whatever the object is we are systematically observing and studying, and put it together with surveying. This guy in the middle with his armed comrades is Amilcar Cabral, who you all know was a revolutionary, who was one of the leaders, intellectual and political leaders of the PAIGC, the political party that waged the 13-year hot revolution in Guinea-Bissau, in Sao Tome. And their work, as we learned from Sonia Vash-Borgish, a fantastic intellectual who's a postdoc down at CUNY, was to figure out how to make society completely anew. But they made it from what was, not from what didn't exist yet, and yet they changed how, for example, education had meaning and how gender had meaning, and so forth. But what Cabral did, as this one did, was walk the land. Cabral had been trained to be a member of the professional managerial class of the colonial state. He was an agronomist. He knew the dirt. He knew it better than almost anyone else. And although he had been educated by the Portuguese state to figure out how to make the dirt of Guinea-Bissau more productive for Portuguese racial capitalism, what he did in doing his studies, in doing his surveying and his surveillance, was to figure out what was needed and what was possible to liberate that land. Similarly with Harriet Tubman, as she went out over and over and over again, both as a thief, just having stolen herself, helped other people steal themselves, but also as a spy, working for the Union Army in a way that operationalized a tool of what could become oppressive again and would, in order to achieve something in excess of the future that the Union Army likely had in mind for Black people in the South. I will sit down now after showing you this image, which is by the artist, geographer, revolutionary Trevor Paglin. This picture is called Invisible. That's the title. And what he did in developing this picture was try to figure out how to use the tools of geography, the tools of surveillance, and the tools of surveying to figure out where all of the US military black sites were in the United States and on the planet, and photograph them to show us what we otherwise couldn't see. But for me, this picture also has strong metaphorical value in that I imagine it to be actively and antagonistically the contradiction to what it represents, and therefore it is a picture of us coming to meet ourselves in the abolitionist future. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Beck Jordan-Young. Thank you, Tammy, Avi, Pam, Hope, Che, everybody at BCRW. I have to say one of the highlights of working here at Barnard has been getting the chance to working with everybody at BCRW. I also want to thank Levi, Krish, Sona, Clara, the other student workers. The other amazing thing about working here at Barnard is undoubtedly getting to teach students here. So, as you probably all know, people have been excited about this conference for a very long time. Many have said to me, oh my God, can you believe Ruthie Gilmore and Mariame Kaba are going to be speaking at Barnard? To which I've said, yeah, actually I know, I'm on the panel with them. People would say, oh, okay, well, what are you going to talk about? And I would say, the 1700s. And they'd say, okay, well, good luck with that. So, wish me luck. I'm going to talk today about surveillance, abolition, and internationalism, and I will take us a little bit through the 1700s. So the first use of aerial surveillance in the Americas was recorded in the French colony of Saint-Domingue in the waning years of the 18th century. The device, a manned hot air balloon, was launched at the Galifat plantation and hovered above the island's north coast. From its basket, French colonial passengers gained a sprawling vantage point from which the world could be both seen and imagined, a conquest of air to complement the conquest of land. But in 1791, not all things were so clearly visible. After months of planning, Haitian rebels emerged from the thick woods onto that same Galifat plantation, setting fire to the buildings and fields, choking the night sky with smoke. Despite its omnipotent heights, colonial surveillance had failed to prevent an uprising of enslaved African people in this, the richest of all French colonies, the center of France's power as a capitalist nation. The uprising at Galifat would come to be marked as the first insurrection of the Haitian Revolution, the largest and most successful slave revolt in history. The transformation of Caribbean sugarcane into a global commodity had necessitated both sadism and surveillance. Routine rape, grotesque torture, murder, and the terror born from the looming threat of violence accompanied instruments of vigilant observation like the balloon. What went up in smoke that night were not just the physical structures of enslavement, but also a specific way of seeing, what Peter Linebaugh calls an illusion of omniscience. The self-emancipation of enslaved African people represented an utter rejection of colonial violence, as well as the cold calculations of capitalist vision, the abstract value assessment with which planters, merchants, creditors, and industrialists believed that they could translate lives onto balance sheets. The U.S. as a nation-state emerged in this context of seismic global challenges to colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism, the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, to name just two examples. So as we begin our conversation today, I hope we can understand surveillance in this way, not as a manifestation of domination and control, but as the anxiety of a regime aware of its own illegitimacy. To be clear, I want to think about abolition not because I think it can only be understood in relationship to slavery, but because abolition has always been a global liberatory project against slavery, imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, and racism. And to do so, I want to think about abolition and surveillance as they relate to a term that's very near and dear to my heart and research, and that is internationalism. While internationalism is commonly attributed to Karl Marx, the term was actually coined by Jeremy Bentham, as Ruth Gilmore has encouraged me to think about, a few years before that hot air balloon launch. Scholars of surveillance no doubt recognize Bentham, a theorist of utilitarianism, for his role in the modern prison. Bentham is credited with designing the Panopticon, a system of isolation and control where prisoners are separated from one another, made visible to an unseen central authority, and exposed to continuous monitoring. So for those who are playing surveillance bingo, you can click Panopticon off your list. A dorky joke. So as Foucault recounts, the Panopticon was modeled on the spatial management of plague-ridden 17th century French villages. The panic of contagion, like the threat of insurrection, could be contained if people internalized the mechanisms of surveillance. The Panopticon, in other words, controlled people by making them believe that they were always being watched. Bentham's concept of internationalism was imbued with related questions of sight. Drafted during the US Revolutionary War, Bentham grappled with the laws that would enable a nation to act as a sovereign body once it passed from dependence to independence. And by this, he was not thinking about Haiti or of any other colonies. His writings were replete with racist colonial assumptions. Quote, "Liberty without security is that which is possessed by Hottentots and Patagonians," he wrote. "Liberty by security is thus the possession of which is the pride of Englishmen." Internationalism for Bentham sought to preserve what he saw as an already achieved peace, an iteration of the liberal humanitarianism that Françoise Vergès describes as giving Europe the power to rule over international affairs, to preserve a peace it had unilaterally decided to be universal. This internationalism for C.L.R. James, writing on the Haitian Revolution, was nothing more than a fig leaf, professing order while barely concealing the barbarism of empire. Haiti, of course, was the second independent nation in the Western Hemisphere. The first was, pop quiz, the United States. The independence and economic development of these two nations were deeply intertwined. In the 19th century, both the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution ruptured the stability of formerly popular investment sites for European capital, as both represented extreme instances of market volatility. The US, specifically the sale of its bonded war debts, emerged as a relatively more secure investment, according to economic historians like Scott Reynolds Nelson. In as far as the US could control the uprisings of its own working class, maintain a system of slavery, manage racial hierarchies in workplaces, control its borders, and subjugate indigenous populations through genocidal practices, its economic development represented a more stable investment for European capital by contrast. Security, therefore, meant racism, and racism meant economic stability. These racial regimes of debt and finance came to be also reproduced at smaller scales. Credit rating agencies in the mid-19th century penalized individuals who resisted the dominant racist social order. White men who supported abolition were spied upon by credit rating agencies and routinely denied business and personal loans, as Scott Sandage notes. So when we consider how dominant notions of security are conflated with racist notions of surveillance, we might consider these foundational relations at the heart of the US political economy. But while these circulations of finance, credit-driven racial regimes appear dominant, and while the gridded rationality of imperialism, the all-seeing eye of the prison's panopticon, and the myopia of liberal humanitarianism were inflated with such smugness that they could even elevate hot air balloons, there were, of course, other insurgent sentiments stirring in the period. In the mid-19th century, Frederick Douglass was one of many abolitionists who traveled the world in what historian Manisha Sinha has described as an abolitionist international. Through papers like The Liberator and The North Star, Douglass and his contemporaries like Sarah Parker Remond wrote about the ravages of human bondage as they saw it linked to colonialism, imperialism, the exploitation of labor across spaces of difference. Abolitionists, Sinha notes, were never single-issue agitators. In this critical period of 19th century U.S. state formation, they linked slavery to questions of indigenous genocide and the military conquest of the newly independent Mexican territories. In speeches to Irish abolitionist societies, religious houses, and working men's groups in England, Ireland, and Wales, they spoke, reading my notes, they spoke about labor organizing as it was related to the Organization Against Gender Violence. They spoke of the Irish, the Welsh, the Scots in the same breath as they spoke of the people of India, the Americas, the Caribbean, and Africa. So effective and affecting were their appeals that a gradual shift in consciousness emerged. During the U.S. Civil War, Frederick Douglass toured depressed cotton factories in northwest England where unemployment raged. The Union blockade of the Confederacy had strangled the global supply of cotton, and between 1861 to 1862, unemployment was in the hundreds of thousands, with the city of Lancaster alone experiencing over 300,000 people out of work. In an effort to restore the economy, the British Prime Minister outlined plans for the British to intervene on the side of the Confederacy. These abolitionists asked the British people to do the unthinkable. Do not support the war. Do not support the Confederacy. Do not perpetuate slavery, even if it is against your own material interests. In The Slave's Appeal to Great Britain, Douglass wrote, quote, "Humanity could not permit the needs of the British mills to determine the future of millions in slavery." And most astonishingly, British workers agreed. From mill towns in Manchester to financial and trade centers in London, British workers organized mass public meetings supporting the abolition of slavery and opposing British military support for the Confederacy. In kind, Northern workers in the U.S. sent shiploads of money and aid. In the city of Lancashire, Northern provisions amounted to over 27,000 pounds worth of goods, with over an additional 1,000 pounds in cash aid. That's 19th century money. That's big money. As Philip Foner notes, British dock workers refused payment for unloading the goods, and railway workers transported the aid for free. In April 1863, an ecstatic Karl Marx wrote to Engels about this international solidarity, calling it, quote, "an act almost without precedent." It was out of these large public meetings of workers opposing slavery that the International Working Men's Association arose in 1864. More than empathy, more than mere acknowledgement of other national struggles, the solidarity of the First International, and the most common definition we have of internationalism, was built upon this powerful realization that people could recognize one another even if they couldn't see each other. This other way of seeing, this other form of abolitionist internationalism rivaled Jeremy Bentham's, and I think gives us another important way to root our visions of international solidarity. So these divergent trajectories of internationalism lead me to three questions. The first is one that drives my own research. How might our abolitionist imaginary shift when we draw from a long history of anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and anti-capitalist global resistance? How might this history embolden our visions of freedom at present? Two, how can we think really critically about the ways of seeing that we have been conscripted into, not just in our social movements, but also in academic settings? For example, we're at a very elite college in Harlem. What implicit assumptions are we being trained to reproduce about, for example, who is fit to manage and who is presumed to require management? What other ways of seeing might we be able to engage, and how might that change the way we learn and in turn practice abolition? And finally, thinking about surveillance can be really overwhelming and pretty dispiriting. In my classroom, there is a pigeon that nests right next to the window, which we have affectionately named the drone, as we have conversations that we are being continually monitored by every device in our pockets and backpacks. But instead of being overwhelmed and presuming a dominance to surveillance, I wonder what happens instead when we recognize the anxiety that drives surveillance. What changes when surveillance is reimagined not as a position of dominance, but in a recognition of illegitimacy? What changes when we are all able to recognize the global solidarity that we are feared to possess? How indeed can we begin to realize and cultivate our own enormous and powerful collective strength? These, I think, are the questions before us, and I look forward to discussing them all with you. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to sit here instead of standing because I don't have a PowerPoint. There's no need for me to stand. So that's what's going to happen. I am really so happy to be here. I want to thank Tina and the entire Barnard Center for Research on Women for inviting me to join this incredible panel of terrific scholar activists who really are touchstones for me in my work and in my life. So I'm really happy to be here for that. I also want to thank everybody in the room for showing up early on a Saturday and really, as Tina mentioned earlier, braving the MTA to get over here and joining the conversation. You know, this is, you don't have to do it. And so we really appreciate that you showed up. I'm going to open with an audio story that was created by some comrade friends of mine in Chicago a few years ago as part of a summer program that they ran with young people of color in Chicago who are in conflict with the law. And so we're going to hear from Marquise Payano to start.
I live in a place where everybody watches you everywhere you go. As a young black male, everyone watch you. Police pull you over for no reason. They see you pull up, tell you put your hands on the car. Most of them just be so disrespectful. They'll tell you, you ain't nothing, you ain't gonna be nothing, or you just a waste of time. And most people take that to the head and they grow up disrespecting, killing, and fighting the police. Also, people watch you when you go into stores. In every aisle, you'll see the same employee. You can't shop in peace nowhere. They follow you everywhere. And lastly, gang members. There's no safe place for you to walk in Chicago. Everywhere you go, people ask you the same question. What you is? They ask you over and over again. But on most streets, they don't even ask. They shoot first. I've been running from bullets and asked that question since I was 12. And I don't even gangbang. You can't even listen to some music in most neighborhoods. Some of the rappers get killed because with the stuff they say in their lyrics. You get robbed just coming up the street because people don't know you where you from. Why so many shootings happen in Chicago? Where I'm from, people call this place Chirac.
There are lots of things in what Marquise has to say that are worth excavating and talking about. And I'm going to focus on what he tells us about young black and brown people in Chicago being constantly watched by the gatekeepers of the state, in the police, by businesses that surveil and follow, ask you, making sure that you don't feel like you belong in those places, and by community members, other people in your neighborhood, in your community. I guess a question that I would have liked to have asked Marquise was whether it feels different to be watched by the cops, the store owners, and the gangs. Is there more or less fear or anger depending on who is doing the watching? For Marquise, surveillance really is the norm. It's not an aberration. And he illustrates that surveillance is never neutral and that it is actually situationally weaponized. Marquise demands that we pay attention to everyday, mundane surveillance, the type that exists beyond even the straitjacket constraints of reform, the type that is so normalized and so low-tech as to be considered normal and warranted, so long as it is not, quote, excessive. And that excess depends a great deal on who the target of the surveillance is. Marquise is inherently presumed guilty, and I've worked with a lot of young people who are in that category. And this category is really the peculiar vulnerability of Black people and brown people, but particularly Black people in this country. The police and the business owners and the gang members that Marquise references in his community, they see criminality as inscribed in his body and his being. Either he is in the process of committing a crime, either he has the intention to commit crime, or he's escaping from having committed a crime, or he can be recruited to crime. Regardless, he's assumed criminal. That's what I hear from the young folks that I work with all the time. The idea that young Black people in particular are on some sort of inevitable march down the path of criminality gives license to surveil, to watch, really to strike them down before they grow, which is a new form, a new doctrine of preemption that's playing out on Black people. A few years ago, a participant in Circles and Ciphers, which is a Chicago-based hip-hop leadership development program for young people in conflict with the law that my organization helped to catalyze and incubated for several years, wrote about his experience with the police in his community. He said, "Once my friend and I were walking down the street. We were at Wood Street and 45th, and we had just come outside. Then the cops came, deep, 3 cop cars. Because my phone had a weed plant on the screen, they wanted my PIN number to unlock my phone. But I said, I'm not gonna give you my PIN. So one of the white cops punched me in my stomach and put me inside the cop car. He told me, you're gonna give me that PIN number, and I said no. Then they let my friend go to his house and took me to my house and told my mom to unlock my phone. My mom said she didn't know the code. So the white cop left me with my mom and gave my mom the phone. He left. I went back to the block and saw my friend I had been with earlier and some other guys and told them what happened. I was so mad. And my other friend told me to relax. This is the norm. This is how it is. Get used to it. He and I jumped into the car to pick up his baby girl at school. I was telling him the details of what happened. I just kept going over it over and over again. But then the same white cop that took me to my mom's house stopped us and told me to step out of the car. He put me in his cop car and drove me into the territory of another rival gang called La Raza. He dropped me off there. On my way trying to get home, I got jumped and almost killed for being in La Raza territory. I ran as fast as I could back to my house. I called my friend that I had been in the car with and asked him, what did the cops do to you? He said they had let him go. Then I had to get off the phone because my baby brother needed my help, so I needed to help him with his homework. Later, when I was finished helping my brother with his homework, my friends came to my house and we smoked some weed. If you know and or work with young people of color, especially young Black people in Chicago and other urban centers, the story that I shared will be really familiar to you. And for years, we would complain about the fact that the cops were taking young people that we worked with and throwing them in rival gang territory, hoping that they would get killed over there. And we kept repeating this over and over again, and we would tell people and reporters, and we would make complaints, and we would tell politicians and our older people, and no one believed the young people or believed us until the DOJ report came out a couple of years ago in Chicago and showed that this very thing was the norm and happened a lot. So, young people of color, of course, feel under siege in their neighborhoods, consistently hassled, harassed, targeted, surveilled, and racially profiled. And in the young person that I quoted, I'm going to call him Willie's story, the cops are the agents of violence. The cops are actively trying to hurt him. So old-fashioned, non-high-tech tools of surveillance are already destructive and devastating. So perhaps this is my plea that we train ourselves to see the mundane rather than to focus on the spectacular and on the excesses. Young people of color, young Black people in particular, have no presumption of privacy. That idea is an abstraction. So they are disproportionately subjected to bodily searches and seizures through practices like stop and frisk. Stop and frisk for many is just a giant neon, no trespassing sign for young Black people in urban centers in particular. And what you also heard is that their phones, their computers, their bodies are subject to being searched on the streets, in their homes, without cause at any time. The examples that I've cited suggest that most of the young Black and brown people, that for most of those young and Black people, surveillance and being perceived as a threat are just a daily fact of life, not an academic or an analytic exercise. The vast majority of the country accepts these law and order practices as the price of, quote, freedom and safety. The outcry against mass criminalization, which incidentally is also mass surveillance. These things are not separate, even if they are treated by some civil libertarians as such, is really an overwhelmingly confined to communities of color and LGBTQ folks and others who are on the margins. Yet even in those communities, many have become inured to the routine violation of rights and liberties. In order to have an elusive sense of safety, we're told by politicians and law enforcement that these practices are necessary and that they are in fact colorblind. And we mostly swallow their propaganda. It doesn't matter that incarceration and oppressive policing and surveillance are actually decimating Black and brown communities across the country and poor white communities as well. Black and brown people know that the state and its gatekeepers exert their control over all aspects of our lives. This is just not new. So I'd be interested to know how privacy advocates and some civil libertarians might discuss the concept of surveillance with young people like Marquise and Willie. What's the meaning of bulk data collection by the NSA, for example, to a young person who lives under constant scrutiny already? Would Marquise be surprised or disturbed that the cops are looking for new ways to more easily access cell phone information when his cell phone is already being demanded on point without cause, and he's being taken to his house and his mother's being told to give up his password? What does predictive policing or being included on a gang database mean for young people who are being dropped off into rival gang territory so that they can be killed there? What does facial recognition technology mean to young people who are regularly recognized and hassled by the beat cop in their neighborhood? They don't need technology for that. They just need their eyes. So I don't know the answer to these questions, but it really seems important for us to understand and to know what that actually means if we're going to create whatever we're going to create to try to get out of this mess that we're in. Finally, an abolition politic interrogates the root causes of violence which are masked by the carceral state. My friend, scholar activist Erica Miners says that liberation under oppression is unthinkable by design. So an abolition politic insists that we imagine and organize beyond the constraints of the normal. So beyond mass criminalization, which is an entire system of harassment, of violence, and of surveillance that keeps really oppressive gender, class, and racial hierarchies in place. So our charge is actually to make imagining liberation under oppression completely thinkable. To really, push ourselves to think beyond the normal in order for us to be able to address the root causes of people's suffering. That's the politics that we should be focused on, is a politics that addresses itself to the root cause of people's suffering, that actually attends to the grievances that people have in their day-to-day life, the everyday, the mundane, not the spectacular or the excess. Thank you.
I'm going to model myself on Craig's way of moderating yesterday, which I thought was really effective, and ask you first if you have, pardon me?
Speak into
Mine's not on. This one's on. And ask you first if you want to respond to each other, if you have comments or responses before I pose a few questions, because there's so much and so many levels that are going on in your really profound words. So do you want me to kick it off, or do you want to think together first?
Why don't you kick it off?
Okay. Love to. So one of the things that I found really, one of the threads that I heard going through all of your presentations was the question of the normalization of surveillance as the most powerful mechanism of its reproduction, its social reproduction. And one of the things that I kept thinking about is, and so that's one thing, and one of the things I kept thinking about is, what is the relationship between, and this is something that Nandita said yesterday, what is the relationship between sovereignty and normalization? So when I mean sovereignty, I don't mean necessarily what the sovereign state. I mean about how we consider ourselves sovereign subjects, or whether we should consider ourselves sovereign subjects. And what I mean by that is, who is considered sovereign? Who gets that status, right? Who is not? Which bodies are allowed to be violated and which bodies are not? And how does that in turn produce forms of normalization, of surveillance, of violence, of criminalization? So that's one question. I would love for you to talk about the relationship between how we understand ourselves as subjects in the world, right? And how those understandings of ourselves in turn create the possibility for us to internalize the normal, the everyday of surveillance. So and the second question was raised, it's actually something I want to put Christina and Ruthie in conversation about, which is talking about the relationship between alliance and solidarity. Because Ruthie, your really provocative comment about thinking of allies is a militarized form of understanding our relationship to one another, right? That was really striking to me. And at the same time, it was equally striking in Christina's talk, where she was actually talking about international forms of solidarity as ways of recognizing your relationship to others, right? And so again, it flips, it kind of goes back to Mariame's comments as well, in terms of who gets seen as, what are alliances, right? What is solidarity? And how is that, when is that on the table even, for some folks who aren't even recognized as sovereign bodies, right? So those are two sort of directions that I'd love for you guys to talk to each other about.
I have a couple of things to say about sovereignty that might not sit well in this room, but I think that one of the problems that we encounter over and over again, and when I say we, I mean people who are thinking and doing in the post-colonial world of the North Atlantic in particular, although not exclusively, and in the still colonized world of the North Atlantic, particularly, although not exclusively. And that is that we have a tendency to default to definitions and understandings of freedom and liberty that are essentially, capital L, liberal. And I mean liberal like from the books. I don't mean that person thinks they're not a racist because they're not rude to me on the subway. Not that liberal. So Nikhil Singh has a new book about this, which is terrific, called Race in America's Long War. But it goes all the way back. I mean, it goes back and back and back. But you can go back and read Locke's Second Treatise and see all of this unfolding. And if you don't have the patience to read the Second Treatise, read Robinson Crusoe and you'll get the same story. They're written about the same time and with the same concerns. And so in Robinson Crusoe, who's sovereign? It's Robinson, right? It's Robinson. And Robinson's entire consciousness as the entrepreneurial individual is supposed to captivate the minds of every seventh grader who reads that book. And what the seventh graders don't notice, because very few teachers of Robinson Crusoe point this out, certainly I didn't encounter this when I was in the seventh grade, which was 1962, and that is that Robinson Crusoe had a plantation. Like all this alone on the desert island crap, and then he runs into Friday and the footsteps and all that, he had a plantation. And somebody was holding the profits from his plantation in trust for him, in Lisbon actually, which is where I live now, until such time as he came back to life because he had disappeared from them. So what I wonder then, in saying this, is whether we might not ask ourselves if looking to the details of formal liberalism is not a waste of our time, and that we might better look to the details of other forms already existing that Christina talked about and Jordan talked about and Mariame is pointing toward, of freedom that matter and don't go back to the hierarchy and certain kinds of distinctions of difference that we're trying to get out of. So that's my thought of your first question.
Devastating blank stares. Okay, let me see what I can do with this. So, you know, I've been really compelled by this comment that Supreme Court Justice Sandra Sotomayor made in her dissenting opinion of the 2014 case Utah versus Strife, as she's talking about the not just the mass arrest, but the potential for police to stop and search anybody that they decided might potentially be committing a crime. She described a condition of people feeling like they were, quote, subjects of a carceral state just waiting to be cataloged. And I think, you know, so in answering your first question, Tina, of how do we understand ourselves as subjects in the world in relationship to policing, I think this is a really productive category to think about this other condition of being on the verge. So I really, you know, I really appreciated Mariame's point about calling our attention when we're thinking about policing and surveillance, not just to spectacular acts of violence, but to the mundane, to the ways in which criminalization exists as a condition of possibility, you know, so that anybody can be determined to be either in the process of committing a crime, possessing the intention to commit a crime, escaping from committing a crime, or potentially recruited to commit a crime. You know, in a recent piece I just wrote for this book called Feminists, Rethink the Neoliberal State, I was really motivated to think about the case of Daniel Holtzclaw, a police officer in Oklahoma who stalked and raped a number of black women there. And when you read through the depositions of these women, you find that the pretext for those stops was this, I mean, Holtzclaw and basically anybody in that police department could pull anybody over and say, I'm just doing a warrant check. And I think that, you know, we need some better spatial language. I think if there's any continuity across this discussion today, it's really thinking differently about space and conditions of being and the ways in which that makes us vulnerable to surveillance, vulnerable to criminalization in a way that is hard to perceive if we just start from the presumption of criminalizations as related to embodied categories, right? These are conditions of possibility. And I guess that relates to the second question about alliances, which is, you know, I appreciate it's a beautiful question and something very dear to my heart. And maybe I'll just say this really briefly. You know, Jordan and I put together Policing the Planet in a real effort to think about solidarity in a broader, more robust way. And I think part of what we were trying to do was to say there's a different kind of solidarity that forms when you don't presume that you already understand like both the subject categories that people inhabit or the forms of repression that the state is deploying against you. And actually by opening up those categories, by thinking about something like broken windows policing, by thinking about surveillance, you actually come to understand that there are, you know, both a number of ways that we're imagined to be working together, and there are a number of ways that that repression already unites us. And so, you know, for me, thinking about solidarity, you know, as something that could approach the way that the state is afraid that we are united. If we can think about solidarity in a way that doesn't presume already existing categories of being, if we can think about solidarity as something that unites us because of the ways that we are repressed and watched, then we can develop something that's bigger than I think we have the capacity to imagine at present.
I can say something about the sovereignty question. I think my idea about focusing on the Cold War origins of contemporary mass surveillance is trying to think, I get precisely about the ways, and it links to Mariame's comments, about the ways in which a supposedly race-neutral ideology captured the common sense and became a way of justifying imperialism, surveillance, the kind of everyday and routine policing of Black and brown communities that you described in Chicago and elsewhere. And I think that, this way of thinking of yourself as a subject of a counterinsurgent state is really important. And it's a theme that connects various struggles from the heavily policed neighborhoods of Chicago to the kind of work that Ruthie and Craig describe in Policing the Planet, the kind of counterinsurgent, broken windows policing of, say, public housing residents in South Central Los Angeles, right? Or, as we'll learn later from Arun Kunani, about the ways that counterinsurgency logic has informed Islamophobia and, the mass surveillance. Or Rachel Buff, who talks about this in her new book, Organizing Against the Deportation Terror. So I think it's helpful for thinking us about the relationships between struggles that are seemingly discrete and shows in the ways in which there's actually as you said, Ruthie, the surveillance state targets all of us, and so maybe we should think in more capacious ways about that.
So I know that there have to be a lot of questions. So I want to open it up. We started a little bit late, so I'm going to take a little bit more time.
First of all, I'm just so grateful for this panel, and I felt really moved with just the amount that I just learned, and also the amount of work that your research demonstrates that brings all this stuff. So thank you all so much. I have a very specific question, Ruthie. I was just wondering if you could. I also found your piece about alliance and difference really provocative, and I wondered if you could just get more specific for us. Like, I really want to dig into what you're seeing, like that is producing that concern for you, and about the way we are operating right now, and kind of what you're wanting to see. If you could give us some examples, I just felt really taken in by what you're saying. So thank you.
Should I do this now?
Yes.
All right. Okay, what am I thinking? I'm thinking the following. For good reason, for many years and in many places, people who have been organizing or thinking that maybe they could or should organize against their own vulnerability have asserted particular identity categories that are real, that are vital, and should be recognized. All of that is true. But what has also happened, and this is part, I think, of the normalization of devolution, under neoliberalism, that somehow more local is always better, right? If you can touch the state, it won't hurt you. This young man in Chicago gets touched by the state all the time, and it's not helping him. All right. So, but with this devolution-shaped consciousness, more and more people, especially in my experience in this part of North America, so the US and to some degree Canada, I cannot speak to Mexico, or the Caribbean, but in this part of North America that I know, people are, for reasons I think of considered self-defense, so that's not a bad thing, are drawing boundaries around themselves, their categories, their organizations, their concerns, and their goals, and then considering whether and to what extent and under what circumstances they will join into something most normally, in my experience, called alliance with others. This, to me, is thinking through the configuration of the nation state and militarism. That's what I think. And I can't get away from it. So the hard thing here, and I acknowledge this, The hard thing here is to imagine and imagine again how those distinctive forms of difference, right? How those distinctive forms of difference can enable, I'm going to use Christina's word because I like it, can enable solidarity rather than insist on particularity, right? This is, and it's hard, I understand it. But I could give some examples, in the early 2000s in California, a group of us were trying to stop the state of California from building and opening its 25th new prison, mega prison, 24th, lost track. And the prison, like all of the new prisons that California built since the mid-1980s, was going to be in a rural town in central California. California's big, you know, gigantic. So we organized and organized and organized and organized to try to stop this prison. Since there were basically 6 of us, we couldn't do it on our own. But the way that we could make solidarity with people who might not think that criminalization and incarceration was in the cards for them was to understand, as Cabral and his comrades did, or as Tubman did, certainly not working alone, although we always picture her alone, to imagine what the terrain of struggle was for people who were there in that region, right? So it is, as Christina says, spatial, it's territorial, and one thing that we took very much to heart, and I've only just recently started describing this way, is understanding their territories of selves, which is what comes out of the capital L liberal sovereignty way of being in the world. And the way it worked out, and this is going to be in the new edition of Golden Gulag, which will be out next January. The way it worked out was that people already had understandings, and if the questions we asked were better than the questions that we had been asking, we got better answers. So instead of saying, why do you want this prison, we would say, what do you want, right? Instead of saying, do you know somebody who's locked up, although many people did, we said, what do you know about vulnerability? Who's worried? And to what end? So we didn't have to do any of this bipartisan bullshit of making solidarity, this is live streamed, right? Bullshit. With, the right wing of any political party, and I'm pointing fingers at all the political parties for the person who said we didn't take, I'm wearing a red star for a reason, all right? that isn't the way to go, but we used every available language, provocation, understanding, capitulation, to create, in a robust way, an abolitionist geography in Central California. And while we didn't stop that prison, they couldn't do another one. They couldn't do another one. We actually did create, slowly, with labor unions and all these kinds of people, right, an abolitionist geography, which is the antagonistic contradiction of carceral geography. That's what we did. Nobody recognizes it among those who look only to top-down explanations for things, but it gave me some really substantial and visceral understanding of what could be possible. So I hope that answers your question.
It really warmed my heart that you were referring to history and, giving us a long view. Here's what's troubling me. I think, I'm wondering, and just your reaction to this, when we depict surveillance systems as ubiquitous, as watching all of us, does it underestimate the extent to which they have cracks and willful omissions? They are racist, gendered, the non-surveillance of a Nicholas with a K Krauss, of a Dylan Roof, of a white terrorist, the non-definition of those guys as terrorists. I mean, there's a whole selectivity. So I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yes. I think, yes. You know, look, I'll say this. I think that, I think everybody is being watched. I think that surveillance is not weaponized against everyone equally. And I think that's the difference. But the idea that there's a place where some people aren't under surveillance in some way, to me, isn't the reality. You know, it is a ubiquitous situation at the point we're at right now. It's just that, I think as Ruthie says, it's important to pay attention to the categories of the people and the kind of the entities that are seen as the ones who provoke the most anxiety, as, you know, Christina brought to the conversation around, you know, can we exploit that surveillance in some way, since its root could be because it's seen as so illegitimate and they see themselves as illegitimate in power. And so, like, where are the cracks for us to actually resist, to be able to make a difference for the totality of everybody? So I do think that, yes, this is the reality that we're dealing with, but I do think there's also, it's just important for us to keep thinking about the weaponization of surveillance, in my mind, because that has direct impact on people's lives. And I just don't think we can motivate people to action, to organizing in the abstract. I don't think people respond to ideas as much as they respond to what is happening to me tied to the idea. Like, that it makes sense then for you to want to think about your analysis when something keeps happening to you, you recognize that it keeps happening to you, and now you want to understand why, because somebody's interested in the thing that happened to you. So that's where I'm always really pulled as an organizer, is to think about those, like, again, the sources of people's suffering, the material needs that people have that you use in order to be able to think about the world alongside the fight for addressing those material needs, and those sources of suffering. So I hope that answers your point a bit. Yeah.
So, you know, one of the intentions with my project, my talk here, the book that I'm writing, is really to, I think, intervene in this really weird moment we find ourselves in, where we are in midst of a capitalist crisis, and yet the language to talk about capitalism seems very inaccessible. Now, I situate myself in a different tradition. Ruth Gilmore is my mentor, and she has taught me about the selection and reselection of ancestors. So when people say, well, you can't think about Marxist concepts or language because that's a Eurocentric tradition, Ruthie has taught me to say, well, you know, what if you think about the Marxist tradition as something that's informed by people like C.L.R. James, Walter Rodney, Claudia Jones, Cedric Robinson, Angela Davis, Ruthie Gilmore. I'm also a student of Robin D.G. Kelley, who has taught me to think about what he calls, in the preface to an edition of the Communist Manifesto, other streams of internationalism. And these are, as I described today, traditions of internationalism that come from anti-racist, anti-colonial, and anti-imperialist traditions. And what I think so significant about this form of inquiry is not just that it gives us a different way to kind of trace the history of struggle, solidarity, but I think as meaningfully, it also gives us a different way to think about capitalism. Boy, and I feel like I'm about to launch into like a whole nother lecture. So I'm writing a book about this. I'm going to spare you it, but I do think that you know, both of these things are warranted. That we both can't just think about capitalism and the evils of capitalism as the exploitation of labor as a Eurocentric tradition, but we have to think with all these people. We have to think with my colleague I'm so lucky to work with, Manu Vimalasheri, who's asked us to think about continental imperialism. What happens when we root radical traditions of indigenous people in the Americas, when we think about Asian immigrants in the Americas? What other forms of struggle, but what other visions of capitalism? Capital as it relates to the valorization of property, consumption, transportation, destruction, militarism. How does this change the way that we not only think about capitalism in the abstract, but how does it change the terrains of struggle that we can identify? And I think that's always what we need to be doing.
Thank you, and thank our panelists, please. Yeah.